Hello, everybody, this is Nahaz, and welcome back to Esports Economist. I wanted to try something a little bit different with these videos. The last one that we did was on the Dota 2 major system and the opportunities that I thought it was going to create in the scene. I'm going to try producing some content over the next couple of weeks of a little bit broader relevance in esports. Those of you who are looking for TI7 content, don't worry, that is coming. But I also have an article, for example, on ESPN.com today talking about what we can learn from the four major esports, giving my perspective as an economist. So I'm going to try and branch out a little bit here. And we're going to touch in today's video on a number of topics that I find interesting in their own right. So please do let me know what you guys would be interested in hearing about in the comment sections below. But today's topic is about brand equity. This is a very important concept, both in traditional sports, and we see it being built up over time in esports, and it's something that I think is going to continue to become even more relevant as the esports industry continues to grow. So what exactly is brand equity? Take a look at the white shoe you see on your screen. Ask yourself, where do you think this shoe would be sold? What kind of store? What kind of person do you think would wear this shoe, and how much, for example, would you be willing to pay for it? And then ask yourself, does this change your answer? These are two functionally identical shoes. So this is not necessarily a perfect thought experiment, but I do think it has some meaning. The question is, does the presence of the characteristic Nike swoosh affect the kind of person that you think would wear this shoe, where you think it would be sold, or how much you would be willing, or you think someone else would be willing to pay for it. Now, it just so happens these two shoes are functionally identical. These are both Nike Air Jordan 1 lows, and apart from slight differences in the tread pattern, as well as the weathering of the leather on the outsole, these are basically identical shoes. Now, I said it's not a perfect thought experiment because if you did go ahead and look at the upper shoe in a store, it would have the Nike brand label on the toe and presumably also the inside of the heel. And the classic definition of brand equity is the price or the value premium commanded by a product or by a firm with a recognizable name or symbol when compared to a generic equivalent. So this is not exactly a generic equivalent, but I included it as an example of how this kind of branding or logo usage can change a consumer's perception of a firm or a product. So where does this brand equity come from? Now, this is something, depending on where you take a course on marketing in a business school or what book you read this in, this will get broken up into 3, 4, or even as many as 7 different categories. I went ahead and went with 3. I think that's plenty for the discussion that we're having right now. The first is recognition. The first step in any creation of brand equity or brand value is that customers easily recognize and identify the product, where it's going to be sold, and what purpose it's going to be used for. So the first step is that customers have to be able to identify that logo or slogan, what have you. The second is when they do identify that particular brand, what kind of image or association does that create in consumers? Consumers are going to attribute positive or negative attributes to the product depending on that brand. And now this is where some sources will start to distinguish between the attributes ascribed to the product that actually have to do with measurable quality, like on the previous slide, is this a quality shoe? Is it going to last? Is it suitable for high stress athletic activities? Versus what kind of things is the shoe used for? Are you going to be cool for wearing it? Do you think about Michael Jordan wearing this shoe and this shoe is going to let you be like Mike and dunk a basketball? Good luck if you're me, okay? But there are both tangible and intangible aspects of a product's image that, for the sake of our discussion, we're going to go ahead and lump together. And finally, the loyalty or connection over time. This overlaps a little bit with the image or association because, of course, the kind of image that you ascribe to a product does affect how your relationship with it changes as you experience the product over time. But this is a distinct aspect of brand loyalty. It's very hard to be loyal to a product when you're not loyal to your vacuum cleaner. You're loyal to a Dyson, all right? You're not loyal to lager, you're loyal to Budweiser, all right? As you have positive, hopefully, experiences, any of these factors, by the way, can work in the negative direction as well, all right? But as you have hopefully positive experiences with the product over time, that brand, the fact that you're associating with that product with a brand, research has shown that that reinforces those positive connections and their ability to impact your future purchase decisions. So those are kind of the three branches for brand equity. Examples of each. Recognition, this one's easy. This is why you see so many billboards out there or so many, 12-second commercial spots that are basically just the logo. This is happens to be in Times Square. If you had no idea what Prudential was, perhaps even if you have no idea what Coca-Cola was, you're not going to learn anything about the product, okay? But just the branding or the association of the name and the logo in the customer's mind, or the name and the appearance of the product in the customer's mind, is worth spending millions and millions of dollars to a lot of companies. In the esports sphere, this is also why there have been some jokes lately about Major League Baseball potentially suing the new Overwatch League over their logo. A lot of people kind of saying, well, what are you talking about? These look nothing alike. Why would Major League Baseball take umbrage of, the dual colors around Tracer in the owl logo? Well, to me, not saying anything about who's right or wrong in that specific instance, that is an example of just how fiercely companies are willing to protect their brand and their imagery. That's something that they've invested millions and millions of dollars in over a very long period of time. They are very protective when somebody else comes along and puts down a logo that they perceive being anything like theirs. Image association, the easy example is beer commercials. You take your typical Corona commercial, shows people on vacation, on the beach. You see the lady in the office sipping her Corona, and she looks like she's on the beach, and at the end of the commercial, she's really in her cubicle, okay? Things like this. It's brand being associated with status or experiences. And, beer commercials for other types of products, they try to reinforce that image association. All right. And loyalty, this is something you see a lot, particularly for durable goods, like for car manufacturers. You see Ford being advertised as the most searched, the most purchased. And in particular, when you talk about automakers, a leading statistic that they look at in their marketing campaigns is owner loyalty. If you buy our car now, are you more likely to buy it again? And how can we maximize that kind of brand retention so our consumers are going to be coming back in the door of our dealerships? That's an example of the connections that you form with your car over time. And the connections are not independent across people. A very successful strategy in the generation of brand equity is the emphasis to the consumer that they're part of a large group of people with desirable characteristics that all consume that product and that all have these great ownership experiences and maybe can even relate them with each other. There's a very sociological aspect of all of this, in addition to the economic and psychological value that we're talking about for the other points. Okay, so where does this come in? I think the easiest point of entry into our discussion for esports is to look at how brand equity is developed and applies in traditional sports. So it's a little bit more complicated than it is in the classical textbook sense, not the least of which because you have this kind of hierarchy where brand is actually being established simultaneously on at least three different levels. First of all, the level of the league or the front office, then the level of the teams or the individual franchises, and then all the way down to the individual players. And as we'll discuss, the potential for generation of brand equity does flow up and down these various layers of the pyramid. So one question, if you're a third-party sponsor and you want to develop some kind of promotional relationship with an entity in traditional sports, is what's your point of entry? Are you going to partner with the league like Kinko's and others have with the NFL? Are you going to partner with an individual team like you see on the local level for ads at businesses in a particular city? Or are you going to, most famously with Michael Jordan, but Nike, of course, has relationships with a number of players, including Derek Jeter of the Yankees here, good old Captain number 2. some people will actually go as far as associating with individual players. And you can see kind of here are two examples of these points of entry where you see at almost every major sporting event, there are products being advertised in the background on the field of play. That can be the result of the third-party sponsor either interfacing with the league or the teams. And you see all the time individual players like LeBron James are featured in advertisements for a particular brand like Nike. And of course, there are economic flows in both directions among all of these entities where fans and consumers, they consume the media product being produced by the sports league in exchange giving their money, and the third-party sponsors want to get on board as a way to hook fans into their brand. And they, in many cases, they want, the beer companies want you to associate consuming their product with, say, watching a baseball game with friends. That's a positive association for them. For many of them, similarly to the way that being on a beach would be for Corona. All right. Now, in order to understand what's going on here, we need to expand our definition of brand equity a little bit, because the definition that we gave earlier technically only applies when we're talking about an individual product or firm. That being the idea that because of a brand, a individual product or a firm might be valued differently, higher or in some cases lower than a generic equivalent with equal attributes in all respects. So if you went out and you made shoes that are every bit as good or every bit as high quality as Nike, all right, would they sell for the same price? Probably not. Why is, for example, LeVar Ball is a big prospect right now for the Lakers. Why is his dad creating so much stir right now in the sports world? It's because his father is directly producing and marketing his own line of shoes. And those interactions have actually had a direct impact on some of the discussions about his son's future in the league and future as an athlete. So there's a lot of money involved in these things. Anyway, to understand what's going on here, we are going to expand our definition of brand equity, and we're just going to define brand equity for an individual athlete or team as the total value of brand equity that they either do or can create. Most of the time, for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, we're going to be looking at potential in the medium to long term rather than the immediate effect, but it can be either. I find it useful in thinking about the way that this is generated. I find it useful to break this down into three categories, the first of which I'll call direct or first degree, and that's brand equity in goods or services that the player or team is producing and or marketing themselves. So the player's ability to command money for speaking appearances, either during the career or after they retire, or the self-named, the big baller brand, the self-named shoe line, a team's enhanced ability to sell either its tickets or its merchandise, all right, depending on its brand and its success on the field and or the marketability of its players. For esports, live streaming is a very, very big deal. Individual players, you can be an 8K MMR player and stream Dota 2 on Twitch, and you're probably going to get a couple hundred views if you're lucky. If, on the other hand, you've played for a TI championship team, it's easy. Not easy, but it's very possible you add another 0 or 2 on the back end of that. People forget when we talk about Sing Sing, for example, that guy played on the main stage, played Meepo on the main stage at TI4. He has had a presence in the competitive scene. And despite the fact his stream is known for a little bit more memery, his presence in the competitive scene did help him catapult himself up the ranks on Twitch. Sponsorships, okay? So second degree. I'm going to call that a direct relationship between the player and those third party, or the team and those third party sponsorships. So, Roger Federer advertising for Rolex or Gillette, for example, the athlete appearing personally in ads with no identifiable team logos, endorsing a particular product. And again, it can be a direct endorsement of one of the product's characteristics in relation to its suitability for what they do professionally, like Roger wearing certain tennis shoes, or it can be simply Roger with the Rolex on his wrist as a status symbol. Hey, you want to be like Roger Federer and wear Rolex. So that's second degree. Third, and very important for what we're going to be possibly even more important for esports and for traditional sports, is the idea of this brand equity potential being transferable up and down levels of the hierarchy. So additional first or second degree brand equity that's contributed by the entity to other pyramid levels. So part of a star player's brand equity is what they're going to bring to the team. All right. That team's logo gains value in a lot of cases in the short run, and in some cases like Derek Jeter and the Yankees, like Michael Jordan and the Bulls, in the long run via that player's association with that particular team or franchise. It can also go the other way. It can go down the hierarchy as well, that players can gain a lot of enhanced visibility after joining a large market team like the Yankees. You know, an average player on the New York Yankees arguably ends their career with a lot more earning potential based on their personal brand than a player on a small market team. And there's been a lot of theory about how that can affect contracting and how that can affect player salaries and league revenues as well. If we were still at a business school, the business school culture is all about acronyms, and we would do something like make up a clever acronym. We would make up something like BEEP, brand equity earnings potential, and be very proud of ourselves. We're going to stick with brand equity itself for now, with the understanding that brand equity can refer to value created in a product or affirmed by the brand, or it can refer to a player or a team's or league's capacity to generate brand equity for the products or the firms that they maintain relationships with. Okay, esports. So brand equity in esports is even more complicated than we're talking about for traditional sports for a couple really interesting reasons, at least interesting to me. So first of all, third-party sponsors are looking, in traditional sports, we talked about this, they're looking at multiple potential points of entry and what makes the most strategic sense for them, what offers the biggest bang for their buck. In esports, all right, there are even more potential points of entry. There are complex interactions between all of the potential parties in this equation, from pro players to the sponsoring teams and organizations to tournament organizers, the game developers themselves, all right, that are manufacturing their own products that become esports, and the customers and the player base. There are a lot of developers right now, for example, asking the question, we have a game that we think is really good. How can we facilitate it becoming an esport? Because there is all of this additional economic possibility once that happens. Third-party sponsors are usually going to be looking at relationships on this half of the wheel. And by the way, the game developers themselves, adding another layer of complexity to this, become in some ways third-party sponsors when they use one title to promote their other titles. But again, we're going to abstract from that for now. So there have been a number of sponsors that have tried out different points of entry. Red Bull is probably the best known for developing relationships with individual players like Bjergsen here from LoL, and hopefully I'm pronouncing all the names right. I am a Dota 2 guy, and Nadeshot here. They've had individual relationships with Red Bull on an ongoing basis. Demon from our Dota 2 scene has had a relationship directly with Red Bull as well. They're one of the few prominent firms that has gone out and sought to forge relationships with individual players. A little bit more common are relationships between third-party sponsors and teams or team sponsors. So you see here the partnership between Xfinity and Evil Geniuses. There's even I've thrown in a Maxinomic chair here for good measure. All right, another brand sponsor that chooses to associate with a team sponsor. This is fairly attractive for them because, again, unlike the players, the esports player base is becoming a bit more unified, but it still is quite fragmented. Players are going to have a presence typically in only one corner of the esports world. These two guys are some of the few exceptions that are well known, I think, throughout esports, regardless of the community that you're in. The other possibility, which we've seen recently, is partnership with tournament organizers. Like it was just announced yesterday that Mercedes-Benz is partnering with ESL One, and that their first focus event together is going to be ESL One Hamburg, the first Dota 2 major in the coming fall season. So that's very exciting. And similarly to working with teams, that offers a potential third-party sponsor a diversified presence and multiple points of entry with access to different esports fan bases that, again, they overlap, but there's some interesting data from Twitch. There are these clouds showing overlaps in viewership, and one of the kind of notorious phenomena is that the League of Legends and the Dota 2 viewer base are actually shockingly disjoint. There's a lot more overlap between Dota 2 and CSGO, a game in a completely different genre, than there would be between two games ostensibly in the same genre in Dota 2 and League. So take that for what it's worth. Again, there are a lot of challenges for third-party sponsors evaluating this space. The importance of organizations. Now, one of the things that I'll preface this with, when we started thinking about branding in economics and in marketing, there were a few papers in the late 80s, but most of that was going on in the 90s. For a portion of the time that I was at Chicago in the 2000s, that research was also going on, and a lot of it was about the impact of branding on your more immediate purchasing decisions. So can we design advertisements or design ways to promote your brand that makes it more likely that a particular consumer will choose your product over its competitors? So it was very short run in its focus. Increasingly, if you look at the more recent literature, brand equity is being viewed as a medium or long-term investment or phenomenon. It's not all about product choice. So I go back to in 2000, the Harvard Business Review published what they called a branding report card with 10 bullet points that you should look at to assess the strength of your brand. And even then, over half of the bullet points used language like long-term or build or develop. Very forward thinking, and about brand equity or a brand identity being something that you develop on an ongoing basis, rather than what kind of commercial can I run that'll make it more likely that somebody buys my product tomorrow after seeing it. All right. And there's kind of a neat, more recent paper I believe this is in Marketing Sciences. I could have the journal wrong, by these two authors that I'm not going to try to pronounce, Slothgraf, I would assume, and Pauls. There, I just did it. And they used a panel of data, and they evaluated over time how the total brand equity that you have at current can interact with the efficacy of various marketing initiatives. And they found out that in the long run, a larger firm, it's possible to develop brand equity in a large firm in such a way that you not only have a more valuable brand, but that the future marketing actions that you take can be even more effective. So brand equity is a long-term phenomenon. Now, again, you bring back esports into the discussion, and investing in esports is tricky, not just because of the multiple points of entry, but because the decision horizons are very different. Esports moves very quickly. I've said, based on my own anecdotal experience, I think a year in most esports is like 4 years in most traditional sports. And so the landscape changes very quickly. Sponsors need to be a little bit more mobile. It's harder to develop those kinds of long-term relationships that you really think about when you build up a brand over time. It's a little easier if your product is it's a little easier for somebody like Razer or SteelSeries, where your product is very close to gaming or very close to something that would be used both by the professional players and by the fan base at large. There's a lot more room for short-term development, but when you're a company like Mercedes-Benz, this is obviously something that you're doing with more of an eye toward a long-term brand recognition and brand development. Now, it's interesting. I titled the slides, "The Importance of Organizations." A lot of people, when they first look at esports, they think, well, actually relatively more of the brand equity in esports should be coming from individual players as opposed to teams or leagues. For example, in esports, you don't have, for the most part, teams or teams associated with a particular city or cities. So, I'm a huge Cardinals fan because I grew up in St. Louis. I was going to Busch Stadium when I was still in diapers. I'm a huge Duke basketball fan because I went to college at Duke. By and large, there are collegiate esports is a thing, okay? ESWC and others are trying to run events with more a focus on countries as team identifiers, but for the most part, you don't have these auxiliary reasons that people become fans in esports, at least not yet, that you see in traditional sports. And you don't, for example, I'm a baseball fan because my dad took me to baseball games as a kid, all right? I'm not going to be a Call of Duty fan because my dad was a Call of Duty fan, at least not yet. We don't have that going on. So relatively more of the attachment in some ways has to be to individual players. What I argue, though, is I think that these individual organizations in esports or the team sponsors are even more important in terms of developing and channeling the potential for brand equity organization within the individual players. I think that by and large, individual esport players, part of this is due to age, part of this is just due to the newness of the industry, but by and large, esports players are not great at developing their own brands. And in what I've seen in other esports, sadly, this is a little lacking in Dota 2, is that teams and sponsoring organizations can play a very constructive role in terms of helping players develop that individual brand, and that's just in everybody's best interest. Okay, so they also offer a point of entry into multiple games or segments, as we mentioned on the previous slide. They offer, if you have a relationship with a team, this also applies to tournament organizers, you also have a lot better ability to take advantage of new titles or new opportunities as they become available. And again, I think the big thing is a team, a strong relationship with an organization can have a big impact on players taking actions that are compatible with developing their own brand equity potential in the long run. All right. One thing that I think is very underrated rather about esports, people in esports, a lot of people are very worried about us somehow losing our identity to traditional sports or losing our identity as more mainstream sponsors come into the space. I actually don't think this is a concern at all. And part of it is I think there's a lot of people, they underestimate the reason that certain third-party sponsors are so eager to get into esports. And that's, in my own view, what is happening with cable television right now bears a striking similarity to what was happening with newspapers around the late 80s and maybe throughout the early to mid 90s that I saw. About prior to that, you saw the number of new newspapers being created falling off dramatically, and it wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that you saw this broad decline in daily circulations among paper newspapers that has continued to this day. You're starting to see the same thing. You see more and more economic reports about millennials, people in my generation and later, turning off their cable in favor of fee subscription-based service or Netflix. And to me, when you talk about the potential in esports, a lot of it is access to a distribution platform through which this new generation of consumers does get their media. When you look at the potential for brand equity generation, Netflix is still a subscription service. In my own opinion, Twitch is way more promising in some regards than Netflix. And indeed, this was data from a couple years ago when Amazon acquired Twitch, paid a bunch of money for them. A lot of people wanted to know what was going on. And the New York Times around that time pointed out that at its peak hours, Twitch is garnering as many total viewers as a lot of these much better known cable TV networks that some were paying for in subscription. In a way, this was a big harbinger of the previous result that we talked about as cable TV has continued to decline. Now, again, this isn't necessarily meaningful as a direct comparison because there are a lot of different titles and games that these Twitch viewers are being split among. It's not necessarily informative to compare these numbers for any one organization, but I do think that the point is there. And by the way, this is also the reason that I'm very excited for Nielsen getting into esports. So I saw a few people the other day tweet about there was an announcement that Nielsen had gotten into esports and was planning to provide data for esports analysis. That's incredibly important. As an economist, Nielsen is the provider of some of the most reliable and important data sets that we have in economics. When you go back to the data sets that are used to analyze those purchase decisions, as we talked about in the early days of brand equity being studied, that was Nielsen scan, or continues to be Nielsen scanner data. And it's very important. We generally in esports, we don't get reliable data or industry metrics like this, except around the time that some big event like Amazon buying Twitch occurs and the big boys like the New York Times get interested. The rest of the time, we don't necessarily have good industry data that's publicly available. I think Nielsen will help that out a lot. I think that esports consultancy over the next few years is going to gain a lot in value and a lot in credibility as that data becomes available and serious economists can do thorough analyses of this industry like we do for others. So let's take a look. Specific observations for Dota 2, since I know a lot of you will know me from Dota 2 and will come here looking toward that title. So as you guys who are familiar with this particular game already know, there is a heavy emphasis on players over organizations. Many players, I think we can all think of examples, do not value or develop their own personal brands. Now, some of the players who had been almost notoriously disdainful of this in the past, I'm talking about you, Jackie, have actually gone a long way in the last year or so to really building their own personal brand and being a lot more welcoming to their fans and to potentially to external sponsors. So I think as the current generation of superstar players is growing up, we are seeing some of that happening naturally over time. But you still see live streaming agreements. The idea that you're going to join a team and you're going to commit to streaming X hours a week under that organization's flag. They're very common in other esports. They're not common at all in Dota. And I think that's a big missed opportunity. I think that can add a lot of value. Now, again, there are very good economic incentive reasons why that's the case. In Dota, the vast majority of most players' salary is going to come from prize money as opposed to guaranteed compensation from the team. So if you compare to other esports like LoL, like CSGO, relative to those, the share of prize money as of player total compensation is much larger in Dota. So players tend to pay a lot more attention to Valve in particular, and to some extent to these tournament organizers than they do to sponsoring organizations. I think that the major and minor system could really help that there's going to be naturally, as there are more events, there's a more structured calendar throughout the year. I think that there's going to be more incentive to go and work with a team sponsor that's going to provide you a steady flow of resources. I've seen a number of teams in the last couple of years. There's an attitude in a number of teams or players that I consider to be, pretty good, that, hey, we're going to save some strats for TI. We're going to sort of take a few events off and then really try hard as, May, June, and July roll around and we're on that TI patch. And I think a number of teams have discovered in the last couple of years that it's not so easy to turn that switch on and off, that really winning a TI requires a sustained effort throughout the season. I think nowhere do you see that more than the last 3 TI champions, that investment throughout the course of the season, never taking an event off and growing your team and growing your individual players. That's how you win TI, not just that really intensive boot camp and you find a sponsor that's willing to support you just for a couple of months. All right. The other things, we've had a real problem that I've talked about in other places with the top teams in some ways are disincentivized from competing under the major system because so much of the prize money was tied up in the majors and TI. Valve made pretty clear with their selections that lands were all that mattered. So online play and a lot of these smaller league plays, sorry about that again, guys, all right, end up getting de-emphasized relative to these larger events. I think the new major and minor system is going to help with that. And I do think that that regulated schedule is going to help a lot of the sponsors that that participate in other esports, but either have been out of or been reluctant to get back into Dota 2. I've already actually gotten a couple feelers from organizations saying, hey, we're in either other esports. We saw your video on the new major system. We're actually thinking about maybe getting back in. And that I view as a very positive sign. That said, I will end on a cautionary note. If you are a player or thinking of becoming a pro player, this is actually a time to be very careful, because many of the new sponsors entering the space are going to care about certain aspects of a player or a team's pre-existing image that maybe the community at large does not. Those memes that we all know and love, don't let your memes be dreams, but don't let your memes destroy the potential that you have to build a powerful brand. And that's, again, where I think teams and organizations, the advice of a manager, all right, Beef in particular does a great job for Complexity doing this. And I know Complexity is it's an organization that I've worked with that does a great job in encouraging their players to develop their own personal brand, as well as contributing to the success of the organizations. I really want to see more organizations in Dota 2 and more players working with such organizations that are going to provide that. I think it's going to contribute a lot to the stability and the success of the scene going forward. All right, so we touched on a lot of issues here. Again, if you're interested in expanding on any of these points or just want to hear about another topic throughout esports, please do let me know in the comment section below. This is Nahaz. Thank you guys so much for listening.